Today on the podcast, we are up to part 14 in our story about Disney artist Herb Ryman. Already we've looked at his childhood, his time in art school, and at MGM. We followed his adventures around the world, and we watched as he started his career at Disney. He came to Disney as the studio was working on Fantasia, but once the war started, Ryman watched as the ambitious projects around him faded away and were replaced by training and educational films, projects largely made for the federal government. Today we pick up our story midway through the war, a war that deeply changed the studio. Oh, one last thing before we get going today. It's spring out here in California, and with the rain, there's now a lot of pollen, and we need the rain, so that part is fabulous. But also, my allergies are working in overdrive, so my voice is going to be a bit nasally and breathy, and all those other amazing things that happen to you when you have allergies and asthma. So, if you have your Flonase popped open and ready to go, if you have your Zyrtec and water set out in front of you, if you've got your inhaler in your pocket just in case, here we go. By the time America had been in the war for 18 months, the Disney studio was an entirely different entity than it had been in the early 1940s. The vast majority of its output was funded by government contracts. The studio made endless training films to help recruits develop new skills. It also made Good Neighbor films for the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, a U.S. agency that encouraged unity between North, Central, and South America. The Good Neighbor films fell into two categories. First, there were the musical and comic cartoons in which Disney characters, such as Donald Duck and Goofy, explored the culture of Latin countries. These efforts were released in Latin countries and the United States. Second, there were the educational films designed to improve the lives of those who watched them. These were only released in foreign territories. The first of these educational films, The Grain That Built the Hemisphere, released January 4th, 1943, was the story of corn with a focus on how its production linked the Americas and influenced the world. Towards its conclusion, the film included practical strategies that farmers could use to create stronger plants with increased yields. But the second film in this series, The Winged Scourge, released January 15, 1943, was far more indicative of Disney's pan-American educational efforts. The Winged Scourge focused on curbing mosquito populations to reduce the spread of malaria. Unlike the military training films, Harry Title recalled that Walt played a dominant role in films that sought to improve the lives of the average person. The 10-minute film explained how malaria was spread, with the goal of teaching viewers how to reduce mosquito populations that carried the disease. Walt understood that the key to capturing the audience's attention was to mix entertainment with education, with a liberal focus on comedy and humor. For this film, Walt approved the use of the Seven Dwarfs, as he thought that these characters were uniquely suited to demonstrate the most and also the least effective ways to manage mosquito populations. After the film explains the long-term effects of malaria, the narrator asks, "Are there 6 or 7 people in the audience who will help us combat this evil?" In silhouette, the 7 dwarves appear on screen as though standing up from theater seats. 6 of the 7 dwarfs effectively demonstrate how to drain pools of standing water, how to screen a house, and how to close gaps in the floorboard, while Dopey, using a poorly made fly swatter, battles a small squadron of mosquitoes, mostly to comic effect. The Winged Scourge was followed by over a dozen similar films, discussing hookworm, tuberculosis, cholera, infant care, and basic sanitation around the home. Ryman worked on many of them, again frustrated that his skills were now being used in the service of basic educational offerings, productions that required minimal training in the fine arts. For Ryman, one high point during this period was his ongoing relationship with Walt Disney. He learned Walt's habits and tastes. You couldn't engage him in any small talk whatsoever, Herbie explained. But Ryman observed how to maneuver around this obstacle. I knew what he would talk about, such as the work we were doing at the studio. Walt would talk endlessly about films in production and how the studio might move through the war. During 1943, Walt was particularly interested in how Victory Through Air Power, once released, would fare at the box office. At times, Walt told jokes, some joke that he'd just heard that had no application to any situation. Walt was simply sharing some bit of humor that he had enjoyed as a way of creating connections with others. Ryman also understood that this was primarily a one-way street. Walt was the comedian, everyone else was the audience. If you told him a joke, he'd just look at you and look bored and never recognize the fact that you just told him a joke. For the most part, Walt didn't care for dirty or adult jokes. Although now and then, Ryman added, Walt would come in and explode some risque joke in order to shock you. So you'd think, wow, did that come from Walt? It was Walt's attempt to show that he was just like the other men at the studio. But Ryman knew this was not true. The activities that occupied many men at the studio, fantasizing about women and boisterous nights out drinking, didn't interest Walt. He was a homebody with a wife and 2 daughters. Such things didn't interest Herbie either. If he had spare time, he was far more interested in painting than he was in a night out at the bar. In the summer of 1943, some Disney artists organized visits to a recently opened military hospital in Van Nuys called Birmingham General, which cared for vets returning from the war. The hospital had special wings for those who had lost limbs, suffered nerve damage, and struggled with psychiatric issues related to combat. Initially, artists sketched portraits of wounded servicemen, but these visits quickly expanded into a variety show developed by Disney employees that they performed at military bases and hospitals from Santa Barbara down to San Diego. Roughly 100 studio employees traveling on chartered buses put on full stage shows complete with music, dancing, and a magic act. These outings were generally a good time filled with laughter and drinking. Ryman, however, was not part of these efforts. Simply, this type of freewheeling party atmosphere was something that he generally avoided. Once more, he spent time at home with his mother, sometimes his sister, and his easel. When Victory Through Air Power was released, it received mostly positive reviews. The New York Times said that Mr. Disney and his artists have animated Seversky's ideas with a clarity that could never be achieved simply through the spoken word. The reviewer extolled the film as an extraordinary accomplishment, marking it as it were a new milestone in the screen's recently accelerated march toward maturity. Mr. Disney and staff can be proud of their accomplishment. Beyond a general release, the film influenced political leaders. The film was released on July 17, 1943, roughly a month before UK and US leaders met at the Quebec Conference to discuss strategies for the Allied invasion of France and Italy. At the conference, key leaders were divided into 2 groups: those who believed that air power should play a greater role in the European invasion, and those who believed the invasion should be largely managed by the Army and the Navy, with air power only offering peripheral support. According to Seversky, while at the conference, UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill asked President Roosevelt if he had seen Victory, to which Roosevelt replied that he hadn't. A copy of the film was then flown to the conference. Churchill and Roosevelt were cloistered together and they saw this picture twice together, Seversky explained. Then they showed it to the combined chiefs of staff, and then they showed it to everybody at the Hotel Chateau Trontenac. Though stories of these viewings are anecdotal, making it difficult to know the film's exact influence, the conference did end with Allies agreeing that air power, particularly long-range bombers, should play a key role in the European invasion to take out key German targets as soldiers prepared to land on the beaches of Normandy. Despite the film's critical success, ticket sales for Victory remained poor. Though the previous year America had watched an endless line of war-related pictures with interest, by the fall of 1943 they were weary of war-related topics as they realized the conflict would likely continue for at least another year, if not two. From a purely financial standpoint, Victory was a failure, following Fantasia and Pinocchio, an outcome that would make it even more difficult for Walt to return to single-story features similar to Snow White in the near future. With the studio focused on various war-related films, Ryman grew anxious to find projects that would once again stretch his abilities. He laid out educational shorts. He painted graphic illustrations, including some depicting agricultural crops. For Ryman, the high point of 1944 was his work on The Three Caballeros, a film that drew upon the artistic traditions of surrealism and abstraction to create South American cities that swayed to a Latin beat and flowers that dreamily transformed into real people. Even after the war ended in Europe, Ryman was still laying out educational films. As the studio had long relied on federal contracts to support its operations, it now considered making similar training and promotional films for American companies to replace the income lost from federal contracts. Everyone at the studio could now see that it would take many months, if not years, for Disney to fully recover from the war. The 1940s were a bad decade for us, Roy Disney explained. We were a young organization. Our fellows were subject to the draft. We lost many of them. After the war was over, we were like a bear coming out of hibernation. We were skinny and gaunt, and we had no fat on our bones. Years later, Ryman would repeatedly claim that his last project for Disney was Food Will Win the War, an educational short that explained how agriculture was a key toward troop victory in Europe, but he was likely thinking of a much later, though similar picture about agriculture and farming called The Human Body, released in Central and South America in August 1945, which explained how a farmer's body is supported by the food he grows for himself and others. The picture featured multiple images of fresh fruits and vegetables, almost surely painted by Ryman. I was not going to be bored to death doing lemons and oranges for an educational film, he said. To Walt Disney, it was a fascinating film, but to me it wasn't. Though during the war, Ryman could justify his work on such pictures as a necessary public service, now with the Allies declaring victory over the Nazis, he had reached his limit. I thought I deserved something better, he said. As he looked around Los Angeles, he realized that it was only the Disney studio that was unable to expand beyond wartime production. There was a time, Herbie said, when I was thought talented enough to contribute something to a major motion picture, and here I am doing potatoes and lettuce and cabbage and carrots and limes for an educational short about proper nutrition. Then a little bit of luck fell his way. The previous year, an old acquaintance, Margaret Landon, had published her novel, Anna and the King of Siam. Landon was the missionary that Herbie had met in Thailand during his world travels. Her book was now being made into a film at Fox. Another watercolorist at the Disney studio, Phil Dyke, encouraged Herbie to reach out to Lyle Wheeler, the lead art director at Fox, to see if there might be a spot for him on that project, particularly as he had first-hand knowledge of the region where the story was set. Later that week, Herbie called Wheeler and laid out his credentials. I lived in Siam, he explained, and I was a friend of Margaret Landon, and I've got a library on Siamese, Thai, Malaysian, Burmese, and Cambodian history. I think I know as much about it as anybody in the country. Then he explained that his job in Disney's layout department hadn't changed his ability as a sketch artist. I can still draw, he said. Wheeler explained that he was aware of Ryman's earlier work. I thought you were tied up at the Disney studio, or I would have called you a long time ago. I am tied up at the Disney studio, Herbie said, but I never signed a contract. Wheeler then suggested that Ryman first talk with Walt, and if Herbie was still interested and available, he would have a job on the picture. For years, Ryman had considered Walt his friend. Ryman was grateful for his job, but he also wanted more challenging work. In Walt's office, Ryman explained his frustration, feelings of desperation that had expanded in recent months. When he'd first started at the studio, they had been working on Fantasia, a lovely picture. But now he was making graphic illustrations for educational films about farming, sanitation, and nutrition. It wasn't that he didn't like the studio, rather that he needed something more. "I'm sick and tired of doing vegetables," Ryman said, "and I've got an offer to go to 20th Century Fox to work on Anna and the King of Siam. I was a friend of Margaret Landon, and Lyle Wheeler wants me to be part technical advisor and art illustrator for the whole picture and lay it all out." Walt considered this. In all likelihood, he knew that present projects didn't challenge his best artists, but still he wanted to keep key people as he looked for a path to return the studio to its former glory. "Herb," he said, "why don't you stay here? There isn't anything in your studio that's exciting as this Siamese picture." Walt knew that this too was true, at least at the moment. "All right," he said. "But you're going to finish what you're doing now, aren't you?" "Of course," Ryman said. He was about to leave, but then added, "I just hope it's okay with you." Then Walt turned to Ryman, taking him in with his dark eyes, a moment of consideration. "Yeah, Herb," Walt said, "as long as you finish what you're doing, go ahead." Ryman left, moving down a quiet corridor to his own desk. This would be a moment he would review many times in his mind, trying to understand what Walt thought of him now that he was leaving the studio. How much his departure would alter the space of friendship that existed between them. The Fox lot Herbie found was a smaller version of MGM, a couple of square miles filled out with shooting locations, from a Western outpost to a Bostonian square, from the sidewalks of Chicago to the French Quarter of New Orleans. There was even a jungle that could be dressed to resemble either the Everglades or sections of Africa. By the mid-1940s, the process of set design had expanded to include scale models. Along with the art director's rough drawings, the sketch artist's story drawings, and an architect's building plans, Fox relied on scale models to visualize how an elaborate set would appear when complete. Ryman immediately understood its importance. As motion pictures became more expensive, models became the way to test the visual appearance of a scene before the entire set was built. For some sets now, Ryman wouldn't work with set builders, rather with model makers. At Fox, Ryman was lowered down into the type of work he had done for MGM. He was surrounded by elaborate live-action sets, big stars, and serious paychecks. Working as a sketch artist also meant living once more in the shadow of a supervising art director. Lyle Wheeler oversaw the visual style of Anna and the King of Siam, while Ryman delineated each sequence into a series of drawings that established the camera's perspective, the general movement of actors, and, most importantly, the elements needed to create a believable set, backdrops, and props. Ryman quickly learned his way around the Fox art department. Among the men there were Marvin Davis and Dick Irvine, who also had recently worked at Disney. Irvine had been the live-action art director on Victory Through Air Power and for the live-action scenes in The Three Caballeros. Once again, Ryman fell into his old habits, arriving early, researching details necessary to create a believable picture, and creating highly detailed sketches to guide production. Anna and the King of Siam proved to be both a financial and a critical success for Fox, bringing in 5 Academy Award nominations. It won in 2 categories, including Best Art Direction for a black and white feature. Once production on Anna was complete, Ryman didn't return to Disney. He stayed at Fox and was assigned to other pictures. Most could be placed into one of 2 categories. They were either period dramas or they were pictures set overseas. This was Ryman's strong suit, work that combined visual research with layout. Among those pictures he worked on were Forever Amber, The Black Rose, Down to the Sea in Ships, and Pinky. During 1946 and 1947, he occasionally saw Walt on a social basis, mainly at Bill Cottrell's house. Ryman later described it as a close friendly association, not as an employee relationship. I was a friend of Walt's, and Walt always treated me in a very close way. Still, Ryman wondered how deeply he had upset Walt by leaving his studio, especially now that Walt was slowly guiding his employees back toward a traditional animated feature. Ryman never asked Walt this question, instead allowing notes of tension or what he perceived as tension to exist between them. Even as he approached the age of 40, Ryman was not good at managing the intimate space between male friends. He didn't always have the vocabulary to guide relationships in a way that he wanted them to move, not even with someone like Walt, whom he had known for a decade. At Fox, Ryman was well-liked and admired. After 2 years of steady work, he slipped into the same mental habits that had defined his career at MGM. Again, he felt the limitations of bringing someone else's dream to the screen. Even though he had worked for months on Anna, the vision and also the Academy Award belonged to Lyle Wheeler. But there were other benefits to his work at Fox. His bank account was again growing large. With financial security, he once more felt the seductive voice of art school, a voice that urged him to paint canvases that were his own, filled with a vision he controlled. That, the voice told him, was the path to being a true artist. I devoted all my spare time, Ryman said, to maintaining my watercolors and oils and portraits as highly personal expressions, not to be affected by any commercial stigma. Back in the 1930s, he had believed that the subject of Asia would be a means through which he would enter the world of serious art. But now he considered that a cultural theme, a set of paintings that spoke to changes in American culture after the war, might be the ticket that finally allowed him to pass from the world of studio art into the world of galleries. Beyond his thoughts about art, his style was changing as well. Though his earlier watercolors of Asia, Maine, and the Southwest were tied to modes of American realism, his current canvases, mostly oils, were more focused on color and contrasts. Oils allowed him to better specify the color range, creating unique and subtle pairings, work that at its high point evoked the melodic haze of a dream. The theme to unify a new set of paintings came to him by chance. During the summer of 1948, his sister Lucille invited him to a cookout with a few hundred people, mostly Western actors and members of a production crew, mainly working on an MGM film with John Wayne and John Ford. By this point, not only had Lucille remarried, this time to actor John Carroll, she was also the lead casting executive at MGM. Among her recent accomplishments was this: she had secured an early screen test for Marilyn Monroe. The cookout, an industry event, was held at a ranch owned by her husband. Among the guests was Bill Antes, a Midwesterner just a few years older than Ryman, who worked as an advance press agent for the Ringling Brothers Circus. He was a thin man with serious brown eyes and thick lips that made him appear deep in thought. He was almost surely there to explore possible film appearances for circus acts. By chance, or perhaps not, he sat next to Herbie. After dinner, he asked those around him if they wanted to attend that night's performance, as he had a stack of comp tickets, which again were almost surely to promote acts for possible screen work. Ryman said he wanted to see the show. By this point, no doubt, Antes understood that Herbie was the brother to one of the most important casting executives in Hollywood. On the way over to the Big Top, Antes explained the customs of Ringling. He informed me of the performers' names, Herbie said, all about the clowns, what the acts were, all about the people in the sideshows and their history. By degrees, Ryman found himself becoming interested in the world of the performers. Almost surely, Ryman explained that he had worked on the Disney film Dumbo, but the actual world of Ringling was far more interesting than the animated world of Dumbo. It was a secret society of performers that moved quietly into town, unfolded their tent, then left without fanfare, performers who embraced the grotesque and the athletic, pushing aside the comforts that most families felt at home for the thrill of being in the ring. We ended the evening with dinner about 2 o'clock in the morning, Ryman explained, because the circus people have a habit of living pretty late at night. Before the night was over, Antes took Ryman aside. "If you're interested," he began, "I can make it possible at some future time for you to travel with the circus." Ryman said that, yes, he'd like to do a series of paintings, perhaps canvases that highlighted the lives of performers offstage rather than their work in the Big Top. In the days that followed, Ryman visited the Ringling production many times. "I hung around and met the circus management and performers," he said. He met Emmett Kelly, perhaps the most famous clown in the world. The circus stayed for nearly a week, offering one show on weeknights, 2 on weekends. Already, Ryman could see how he might arrange his canvases. Here was a fantastic new world, he said, one filled with color and shadows, dreams and disappointments. At the end of the week, Ringling Brothers took down their tent, loaded up their trains, and headed east to Arizona. Once they were gone, Ryman returned to Fox, where he worked on Down to the Sea in Ships, a project that perfectly fit his skill set. The film was a period drama about a whaling expedition at the end of the 19th century. Ryman needed to research the ship's tools and weapons, its rigging and decks, then arrange these elements into sketches. All the while, he thought about the circus. In his mind, as though being interviewed about his future work, he found ways to frame the circus as a serious artistic subject. "I felt the circus was a dying institution in America," Ryman said, particularly with television coming in. For Ryman, though, it was more than this. Not only was the circus a new world to explore, one that had deep roots into American culture, it was a subject no other painter had claimed. It was something that he could make his own. The following spring, he received an invitation to join Ringling Brothers as they started their season in Washington, D.C. The note explained that they had a new white tent. "Come," the note urged, "before the tent gets dirty." But Ryman needed to complete his work for Fox before he took a 6-week break. He eventually met up with the circus in Chicago. Bill Antes arranged for me to have a special private suite next door to a section where the carnival people lived. In other words, these were the people who were in the sideshow. There was the fat lady, the thin man, the midgets, the armless and legless girl, the sword swallower, and the tattooed lady. Ryman lived with the performers, ate with them, and, like all traveling, helped set up the show areas when they reached a new town. In those early days, he tried to earn their friendship as a fellow artist who was genuinely interested in their lives. The performers had learned to withdraw themselves into a private cloister to shield themselves and their thoughts from the peeping eyes of a most curious world of spectators. So I found it a slow and difficult task to acquire their trust. But eventually the performers warmed to him. I did watercolors and sketches. I did my own private documentary, he said. This was for my own benefit, not for the circus, not for anyone else. He loved the challenge of painting the circus, how it stretched him, made him consider new ways to use color and light. It is difficult to convey what constitutes the romance of the show, Ryman explained. The color and music that make up a circus, it's multifaceted. The big top with the flag waving, the clouds in the sky, or the sun beating down, or the rain and the wind. Herbie loved that the circus was always changing, its colors and movements different during the day than at night. He liked the overwhelming visuals around him, something that no artist could fully capture. Still, he tried to suggest the lovely chaos through colors and shapes, areas of light and shadow. Any artist who tries to paint the circus must admit failure before he starts, he said. It is quite bewildering to focus on any one incident or any one personality in an attempt to represent the entire impression. 100,000 paintings would not show the character of the circus. He became friends with CeeLo, the Seal Boy, a 55-year-old man who performed with flipper-like arms, a congenital disability he had had since birth. He spent time with F.F. Unis, the man who could stand on a single finger. But primarily, he was interested in the clowns. Many clowns at Ringling were celebrities or near celebrities. Felix Adler, Paul Jung, Emmett Kelly, who regularly appeared on TV. In those years, Ryman said, there were about 40 clowns with the circus, and I lived most of the time with them in their quarters and on Clown Alley, where they sit in their folding canvas chairs under the tent come rain or shine, awaiting their cue. Visually, the clowns were an amalgam of conflicting images. Their eyes were arranged with sadness, but their mouths were painted with laughter. Their clothes were festive, yet their gestures were that of loneliness. They were very unique people, Ryman said. Ryman created a series of quick sketches, just like he had done when touring Europe and Asia. Already he sensed that these drawings would be the basis for paintings that he would work on for years. Rarely did he ask anyone to pose, as he felt that such arrangements would produce artificial images. With a pencil or pen, he wanted to capture the movement of this world, all of its underlying feelings, its joy and desperation. Johnny and Henry North, owners of Ringling, admired Ryman's work. Anytime you want to travel with us, they said, you're welcome. At the end of 6 weeks, he returned to Los Angeles with hundreds of sketches. He returned to Fox as well, working as a studio artist by day and a painter of circus images at night. Once again, he felt the old drumbeat of art school, a strange music that made him dream of galleries in New York. He was hopeful that these canvases would finally lift him up out of the world of Hollywood, giving him the life that a much younger Ryman had first imagined over 2 decades ago, a person whose achievements in the world of art finally rivaled those of his instructors. Before I go today, a couple of things. First, in today's episode, I mentioned those stage shows that Disney employees put on at military bases and hospitals during the last 2 years of World War II. Essentially, as studio artists contributed to fewer training films, simply because the government, by the midpoint of the war, already had most of the training topics they needed. Some of these same employees looked for other ways to contribute to the war effort in California. These shows were casually called the camp shows and were a significant way that employees at the Disney studio, or at least some of them, supported the war effort. They were a significant part of studio life for many employees, just not a large part of Ryman's life. A couple of years ago, I put together an episode about these shows, what they were, how they worked, and what they accomplished. It's on Bandcamp, and the episode is called Disney and the World War II Camp Shows. On the web version of Bandcamp, it's up at the top right now. And on the Bandcamp app, you'll need to scroll down to November 2021 to find it. All of the Bandcamp shows have dates on the top image, so on the app, that's the easiest way to find this episode. Second, for those of you who outside of this episode are familiar with Ryman's work, I'm guessing that you're probably most familiar with his work on Disneyland and maybe on Epcot. We are almost up to the part where he begins work on the Disneyland project, but also notice all of the experiences that Ryman has been accumulating. His design for live-action sets, working in animation, coordinating with model makers, and so on. These are going to be the unique skills that Walt finds so valuable when he starts work on that park. Lastly, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes. But the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So now I'm going to flip back on my air purifier as the sleepiness of Zyrtec washes over me and hopefully make some of these allergy symptoms go away. Until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.